It's about insight.
What? The company?
Not the company, the system that it's built on. The founders of this machine vetted everyone's raw data, long before there were privacy laws. Every purchase, job search, doctor visit, romantic choice, call, text, every aspect of your lives. Recorded, logged.
Welcome back. In this week's episode, I want to talk about something that really caught my attention during my recent travels. I've spent quite a bit of time in airports and public spaces this week, and I couldn't help but notice just how many people were completely glued to their phones, endlessly scrolling through social media. Now, it's actually pretty concerning when you think about this from both a psychological and privacy perspective. But before I dive into that, I want to take a moment to thank all of my supporters over at Patreon. That's patreon.com/The Lockdown. You are the reason I can keep this show completely free of ads and sponsorships, and for that I really appreciate the support. And it lets me tackle important privacy topics without any outside influence. Now, I've got some great listener questions lined up for today. And as always, if you have questions or just feedback for the show, you can reach me at lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. Okay, the first question. Listening to the podcast, it sounds like you are using pfSense, and I'm curious why you made that decision as opposed to OPNsense, which seems like it has a potentially stronger support network. Now look, the pfSense versus OPNsense debate is something that I do get asked about quite a lot. And you're right, I do use pfSense. Now here's my thinking on this. I've been running pfSense since around 2017, and it has been rock solid for me. Now my system is handling all of my sensitive traffic, managing my VLANs, controlling all of my network segmentation, and when something has been working that well for that long, I do tend to be pretty cautious about changing it. But you have made a very good point about OPNsense. It's a solid fork of pfSense, and they've done a great job in regards to development and community support. In fact, I recommend it to anyone starting fresh because the update cycle and security patching is excellent. They've also made some nice strides and improvements to the UI. But here is my philosophy on this. I know every corner of my pfSense setup like the back of my hand. I've got my rules dialed in exactly how I want them, my VLANs are working perfectly, and my VPN configurations are always on and solid. Moving to OPNsense would mean rebuilding all of that from scratch, and in my threat model, the potential for a configuration mistake during the migration outweighs any incremental benefits that I might get of switching. That said, if I were starting from scratch, I would take a very hard look at OPNsense. Both are excellent options, and I know there's been some controversy and animosity between pfSense or Netgate and the OPNsense community, but for me the choice just comes down to personal preference and what has been working. I don't think the controversy has been anything privacy related. There's just two camps now, and it depends which side you want to fall. Okay, the next listener is actually asked two questions. I'll start with the first one. And they said, what is my stance on running a VPN on the cell phone at all times? They go on to say they're not going to put their phone in a Faraday cage. So is it beneficial or simply a waste of time unless they're willing to go further? Now here's my take. I think running a VPN on your mobile device does have value. But here's the thing. You need to think about what the VPN is actually protecting you from. It's not going to stop your phone from connecting to cell towers or broadcasting your IMEI number. It's not going to prevent Google or Apple from collecting telemetry if that's what you're logged in with and using their services. But what it will do is prevent your ISP, in this case your mobile cell phone provider, from seeing your browsing activity, and also it will help you stay protected if you're using public Wi-Fi. So is it worth it? Yes, absolutely. It's one layer of protection, not the only layer. And it doesn't really cost you anything in terms of convenience. Now, one thing I will say is I don't have a VPN on my cell phone running at all times. And there's two reasons for that. When I'm at home, As the last question alluded to, I run pfSense, and there's an always-on VPN. So no matter what device I'm using, whether that be my cell phone, my tablet, my laptop, my PC, whatever it is, that's always going to be connected through my VPN connection. When I'm outside of the home, my cell phone provider, and this could be Mint Mobile or Tello, whichever you use, mine is in an alias name. And that's why I use a privacy.com card to register that. Now, I'm not hiding anything from the government or law enforcement, but I am hiding my browsing habits from the cell phone provider itself. They don't know my real identity. Do they know where I live? Most probably they're going to have that, but they're not going to know or be able to tie that to my real name. But I still use the Proton VPN client when I'm out and about, and I'm connecting, especially when I'm connecting to public Wi-Fi networks. Okay, the second question is the local police department has installed a license plate reader camera at the main entrance to the neighbourhood. They already have their car and license plate in the database. However, they'd rather not have them learn my patterns of comings and goings, so I try and avoid it. And they said the easiest way is to turn off onto a street that's within line of sight of the camera, but quite far away. How close is too close? Or, if it's in line of sight, am I eating my time? Avoiding the camera entirely would add another 10 minutes to the journey, and that's pretty inconvenient, especially if the family is with them and they're late. They go on to say, am I foolish to think there is anything I can do to avoid Big Brother and his LPR camera, or should I just give up? All right, this is a perfect example of why we need to think of privacy in layers. If the camera has line of sight to your vehicle, I would assume it can read your license plate. These systems are getting pretty sophisticated now, and they can capture plates from quite significant distances, especially if there's good lighting. But don't focus on the one camera you can see. If your local police department is installing these systems in the neighbourhood, they probably have them in other locations too. And it's not just law enforcement. HOAs and private companies are building massive databases of license plate data as well. I would say, instead of trying to avoid one specific camera, I'd recommend a more comprehensive approach. Now, this is stepping into the more extreme territory, so it may not apply to everyone. But the first recommendation is to register your vehicle into an LLC or a trust if your state allows that. Now, if you have finance on your vehicle, I'm not sure you'll be able to do this because they hold the title in your name. But if you can, register your vehicle with an LLC. Now, I use northwestregisteredagents.com. Now, what you can do is register a Wyoming holding company. That will be an LLC that doesn't operate or trade or do anything other than be the holding company for another LLC. So you register that in Wyoming, and that's the most privacy-friendly option, in my opinion, because they don't require your real name and address to be publicly disclosed. And then in your home state, you register your operating company. And I'd name both of these LLCs as obscure as you can. Don't tie these to your identity in any way. Now, the operating company in your home state, let's say that state is less privacy friendly and they reveal the owner, but the owner in this case will be the holding company in Wyoming, so it doesn't matter. Now, the problem of this is some budget. I would budget around $200 a year per LLC, so around $400 a year to do this. That will include annual reporting. You need a registered agent. Northwest registered agents obviously charge for that. That's $125 a year per LLC. So depending on what your state charges for the annual reports, you could be looking at anywhere from $400 to $500 a year. That may be acceptable to you. That may be too far. Now, the other recommendations are more of a grey area. You could use a commercial mailbox, a private mailbox, or even a UPS store for your registration. I would do some research, see what you can get away with in your state. And thirdly, and this is going to be probably illegal in the majority of states, so this is not my advice, I'm just highlighting what is out there and what I've seen some people do. And these are license plate covers that automatically obscure your plate at the press of a button. There's two types. There's an LCD screen variant and another one with the motorized blind that pulls over the plate. Now, these are undoubtedly illegal in the state you're living in. What's interesting is the LCD cover is a plastic or maybe a glass screen that covers the license plate. And when it's not active, it's just transparent glass. You can see the plate. When you press the button, the LCD goes black and the cameras cannot read the number plate. But that said, if the local police department has installed this in your neighbourhood, you're going to find cameras at traffic lights and other locations in the town as well. So really, I think the best option is to do it legally and register your vehicle as an LLC. That may also increase your insurance because now it's a company car. So it is more of an extreme measure, but one that will mitigate that. But remember, I think the goal of practical privacy is not to become invisible. I would love to become completely invisible so I cannot be found by anyone or by anything. But I have a family, I have a day job, I have a normal life. And I think sometimes that means accepting that certain data points will be collected. So we really need to focus our energy on where you can make a meaningful difference. But that doesn't mean giving up. And this is the motto or the tagline of my podcast, is privacy does not have to be all or nothing. We need to approach this in layers and take small steps all the time. It's not a one and done deal. Continually take steps to protect your privacy. If that was me, I'd register my vehicle in an LLC and also take the long way round just to annoy my family. Okay, on with the show. Now, I've been giving a lot of thought recently about what social media is really doing to our ability to connect to each other, as well as the psychological impact, of course. Now, these platforms aren't just tools that are available for free. They're carefully engineered and their systems designed to keep us scrolling, liking, and sharing. But here's what really bothers me. While they're really good at driving engagement, and you can put that in quotes, they're not fostering any real human connection at all. They are just making you the product. Now, when you post something on social media, you're not really having a conversation with your friends or family or anyone at all. You're just interacting with an algorithm that then decides who sees your content, when they see it, and in what context. You imagine having a one-to-one conversation with someone in a coffee shop, with some annoying middleman deciding which parts of your conversation are engaging enough to pass along. But that's what social media is doing. And we've somehow convinced ourselves that having hundreds or thousands of friends or followers means that we're more connected than ever. But in reality, we're just shouting into this void, hoping that the algorithm decides that our voice is worth amplifying. Now, real human connection does not work this way. It's not about likes or shares or whatever metrics these platforms have decided matters. And this is so relevant for us privacy enthusiasts too, because these very algorithms aren't just shaping our conversations and deciding which conversation is more engaging, but they're collecting and analysing every interaction that we have. I think it's time that we step back and ask ourselves, are we really connecting or are we just feeding data into the machine? Now, as you know, I use Graphene OS as my daily driver, and I was in Vegas recently. It was quite funny that my wife actually said, I can't track you. I don't know where you are. And I said to her, do you remember the good old days in the 90s? She would add to the calendar where I'm staying in Vegas, when I'm coming back, when my flights are. But now we're starting to omit those things from our daily lives just because of things like the Find Friends feature on the iPhone, for example. So I think the more removed we become from these features and also social media, we can also start gaining our privacy back. So after spending, I'd say, a fair amount of time in airports this week, I couldn't help but notice that almost everyone, and I mean nearly everyone, was just endlessly scrolling on their phones. They would check Instagram, scroll, then switch to Facebook, scroll, hop over to X, maybe throw in some TikTok, and then scroll and start the cycle all over again. Now, I'm not trying to shame anyone here, but what really got me thinking was not just how widespread this behaviour has become, but what it's doing to us on multiple levels. Now, first, there's the psychological aspect of this. Our brains are literally being rewired by these apps, and this is not by accident. These social media platforms are specifically designed to trigger dopamine hits. This is the feel-good chemical in our brains. Now, a healthy way to release dopamine is going to the gym. An unhealthy way? Well, every like, every notification, Every new post creates this tiny hit of dopamine, and then we find ourselves constantly seeking the next hit. Now, as I was walking around the casinos and hotels in Vegas, it got me thinking that this is exactly the same mechanism that makes the slot machines so addictive. You pull the lever, or in this case, you refresh the feed, and maybe you'll get something rewarding. Maybe you don't. And it's this unpredictability that actually makes it more addictive. Now, I did some research and found there's a technical term for this. It's called variable rewards. And social media companies have absolutely mastered this. But here's where it gets more concerning. While we're caught in these dopamine loops, we're also seeking validation from others or even comparing our lives to what we see online. Now, I see this all the time with my friends and my family. They'll tell me things like, oh, but I need to keep Instagram because that's how I keep in touch with friends, or I must have Facebook because that's how the school communicates with me. But if we dig deeper, a lot of the time they're not really connecting with anyone. They're just watching other people's highlight reels or just feeling worse about themselves. Now, from a privacy angle, this is where things get problematic, because every single time you open one of these apps, you're giving away more data about yourself, and more than you probably realise. It's not just what you post or what you like on these platforms, but it's tracking how you use the app. Like, how long are you spending looking at a post? On Instagram, for example, you're scrolling down reels. If you pause, it's going to predict which video you're looking at and which is most interesting with you, and ultimately what ads you're going to interact with, and it's building this profile on you. Now, I had a friend who recently came to me worried about privacy, and they had accounts on several different social media platforms. Now, each one of those is essentially a data collection point. They're building a detailed profile about who you are, what you like, who you interact with, and ultimately, these apps are not a free product. Again, you are the product. Now, it's a shame that these platforms have deliberately made themselves essential to modern life. And it really frustrates me that schools are not educated in privacy or security. You know, the irony, they're just not educated at all. And they think they're being modern just by using these platforms. But here's what I encourage everyone to do is just take an honest look of your social media usage. Do you really need those accounts? Could you get the same information through more private channels? As you know, I travel a lot. Now, I use Signal for my friends and family. If I see something interesting in Vegas, where I was last week, I'll send a picture to a group channel on Signal. It's fully encrypted. They're not tracking my behaviour or habits. And I have, I think, a closer connection with the friends and family members in that group channel. I wish schools and sports teams would use group messaging apps with better privacy features. And as much as I don't like it, I think WhatsApp is better than Facebook, even though it's owned by Meta. But if you absolutely feel the need to keep some sort of social media presence, that's okay. You know, I'm not gatekeeping. I'm just saying, let's try and minimize this and be conscious of what you're doing. When I was sat next to this lady on the flight to Vegas, for hours and hours throughout the flight, she was on the flight Wi-Fi. She was switching from Facebook to Instagram to X and back again. And I could see this happening in real time next to me. And I don't think she was aware of how bad it has become for her. Maybe you don't need accounts on every platform. Maybe one would suffice for your actual needs. Now, if you're ready to make the change, or perhaps you have friends or family, then this is what I'd recommend. Do a 48-hour detox of social media. It's just 2 days. And you can do this just by deleting the apps from your phone. You can always reinstall them. We're not deleting accounts at this stage, but you're going to pay attention to two things. First, how often are you instinctively reaching for those apps? This is going to show you just how your habit has become an addiction. And second, what are you actually missing? What are you picking up the phone for? Then after those 48 hours, you can look at which apps really served a genuine purpose. Now, let's say you have to use Facebook because you've got your kids' sports team or the school, and that's how they communicate critical information. As much as I think that's a terrible idea, it's the reality we live in. Well, how about you remove Facebook from your phone altogether and only log into Facebook on a web browser? I think this makes access to the social media accounts more deliberate and less mindless. And I actually did this many years ago with Twitter. I stopped using the Twitter app and then just used the website. Now, I don't use it anymore, but this detox is partially why. Now, the reality is we're all part of this first generation dealing with this level of constant connectivity and the algorithms of manipulation that are grabbing our attention. Now, it's okay to take a step back and just say, this doesn't work for me anymore. I'm going to prioritize my privacy, my mental health, and real-world connections over digital ones. Now, from a privacy perspective, every social media account you close is one less data collection point tracking your life. It's one less company building a profile about you, and it's one less potential security risk. Now, I know I've talked about this already on a previous show, but I want to touch again on how to properly delete social media accounts, because I think there is actually a right way and a wrong way about doing this. Now, I do see a lot of people just deactivating their accounts and thinking that's enough, but I think we need to be a bit more thoughtful than that. Now, the first thing we need to do before deleting anything is to grab a complete copy of the data. Now, in the last episode, I touched on this with Claude and ChatGPT, how you can export your data. And it's the same with social media. There's two reasons. First, you might actually need some of that information later. There could be important messages or photos that you want to keep. But more importantly, you want proof of what data these companies had about you in the first place. Now, I still have my archive of a Google takeout that I did many years ago. It's a huge download, but it's worth me keeping. Now, Facebook, I'm sure it's under their privacy settings. I haven't used Facebook for many years, but I do know there's a download your information option. Same for Instagram, under privacy settings, and there's a data download. Every platform has something similar. They just might call it different things. Request everything. Your posts, messages, photos, all of it. Now, while you're waiting for that, and it can take a few days sometimes, depending on how much you have, I want to talk about securing your username. Now, this is something a lot of people don't think about, but this is quite important. You don't want someone else grabbing your old username and then potentially impersonating you to your friends or your family or co-workers. Some platforms don't allow for username reuse. Others do. X, for example. Do your research. If you can change it, what I recommend doing is changing your username to something completely random before deletion. Do the same thing with your display name. And this basically makes it less possible for someone to accidentally find your old profile or try and impersonate you later. But then create a brand new profile with your original username. Now, I did this with Twitter. I think the only downside is that they terminate the account if it's inactive for, 30 days. So now if you go to my old Twitter username, which is @RayHeffer, it will just say the account is suspended. I'm fine with that. Now, for the actual deletion process, don't just deactivate. That's just putting your account to sleep. You want full deletion. But here's the thing. Most platforms have a grace period of around 30 days. It could be longer before permanent deletion. So during this time, if you log back in, even accidentally, it will cancel the deletion process, which is why I recommend removing the apps from your phone. So first, log out of all your devices, phones, tablets, laptops, everything, and then go through the deletion process. Now, while you're at it, you should be using a password manager, so I recommend changing your password too. Now, I remember when I went through my Facebook deletion many years ago now, I had to delete all the photos one by one. They did not make it easy to do select all and delete. I had to go through every photo and delete it. I'm glad I did, and it was worth the effort. I still have those photos that I posted on my Facebook account. But the reason you want to do this is even after your account is gone, some of that content might still be cached on various services or other people's social media accounts. And finally, I think this is the most important thing. Set a reminder in your calendar. So I use Proton Calendar for this. So after that grace period ends, you can try loading your profile in a privacy tab. Make sure you're logged out of everything to verify it's actually gone. Now, I know much of that advice is like preaching to the preacher, but I wanted to share that because perhaps there's someone close to you, a friend, a family member that's on the fence about deleting social media, and there's some useful information in there you can share with them. But while we're on the subject of social media, I'd like to talk about sock puppets. Now, this is more of an OSINT tool, but a sock puppet is essentially an online identity or alias that is specifically there to be anonymous or separate from your real identity. This time last year, I was working with Skull Games at the SANS Open Source Intelligence Summit, and for those investigations where they're trying to find human traffickers, having a sock puppet account is pretty much non-negotiable. You have to do this. Now, where and how you create them is probably out of scope of this show, but I wanted just to mention this because it comes back to deleting your own accounts. I have seen where old domain names that had email addresses associated with it, they've let them expire, and I've done a catch-all. I've re-registered those domains, and I've talked about this before. Expireddomains.net is a good one. So I register a domain, I do a catch-all, so any email at all going to any addresses at that domain come to me. And it's amazing how many social media accounts are on those old domains. Now, I'm not saying to do this to steal other people's accounts to use as sock puppets, but that is one method that people do. They're real accounts that have been abandoned for one reason or another. Now, why this is relevant is you want to make sure if you have your personal domain name that you do not let it expire, especially if it's the recovery email for social media accounts or even worse for your online banking. So do I have sock puppet accounts? I'm not going to say yes or no to that question, but they can be very useful. You might want to look someone up on LinkedIn and you don't want that associated with your own account in any way, shape or form. And the same goes for Facebook. If I need to look at someone's Facebook account, if I try and log in without an account or try and access their profile, it will ask me to log in. So by having a sock puppet that's an aged account that's been in use for a long time, that can enable me to look up that account information. But also, if you are going to do this, I would advise you connect to a different VPN at the time of connecting to the social media. Even if you're using a VPN already, create to another server and also use a different web browser. So let's say you use LibreWolf or Firefox as your daily driver, then access that account in a brand new installation of Brave with a new tab. And then there's email. Now, sock puppets and email are closely related, I guess. Now, for me, there have been a few, and I'm talking a very few, not many, but a few online services that won't let me register unless it's coming from a known email domain, like Gmail or Outlook.com, something like that. Now, obtaining aged Gmail accounts is again out of the scope of the show. I don't want to cross the line there, but these can be useful. Now, while we're on the subject of email, I want to talk about privacy and security with email because I see so many questions, especially on Reddit and forums, where I think people misunderstand how insecure email is. Back in 2004, I worked at an internet service provider managing their email servers, among many things. And I think what I saw there completely changed how I think about email security. What most people don't realize is that it was never designed with security and privacy in mind. It was literally designed to be like sending a postcard. You get a message from point A to point B, and that's about it. Now, when I was managing the mail relay servers, I could literally see every single message that passed through the system. And I don't just mean who was sending what to who, I mean I could see everything. The servers kept detailed logs of every connection, every message, and every attachment. As the system administrator, this would be really useful. I could pull up those logs any time and see exactly what was flowing through the systems in case I needed to support a customer. In fact, we had this running in real time, seeing thousands of emails flowing through the system. And it wasn't difficult. We're talking basic text logs here. There's nothing fancy. And this wasn't a special setup. This is just how email worked. And largely, it's still how it works today. Now, let me paint a picture of how email actually moves around the internet. When you hit send on an email, it does not go directly to the recipient. Instead, it takes hops. These are multiple servers, what we call mail relays, before it reaches the destination. So you can think of this like a letter going through different post offices before it reaches the final destination. Except each of these post offices can see the content of your messages. Now, here's a real example from my ISP days. We had a customer complaining that email wasn't being delivered. So I pulled up the logs to trace the message path. And right there, in plain text, I could see not just the routing information, but the entire contents of their message. They had no idea that their private communication was just sitting in our logs, completely visible to anyone. All right, now this was back in 2004. So you're probably thinking, surely things are different now. Well, yes and no. The basic structure of email hasn't actually changed much since then. But what has changed is added layers of encryption and security on top of it. If we go back to the postcard analogy, imagine putting that into an envelope, but it still has to go through each of these same post offices. Now, since around 2014, email providers started to use TLS, or Transport Layer Security, and this was to encrypt messages as they travel from one mail relay server to the next. And this is good. It means someone can't just sit in the middle and intercept the messages, not as easily as they could back in the old days. But there's a catch. The messages still have to be decrypted at each server they pass through. So these mail relays still need to read the message headers to know where to send it on to next. So if I were a malicious admin at an internet service provider, I could easily read those emails. Now, if you look at something like Gmail, for example, when you send an email through Gmail, Google servers can see everything in that message. They have to. That's just how they scan for spam, how they index your emails for search and other things. And this is just how email works. Now, Proton Mail is slightly different. If you send an email from a Proton Mail account to another Proton Mail account, this is actually the most secure scenario because the messages are end-to-end encrypted. Proton cannot read these messages at all. They can see who you're emailing and when, but not the content. But if you send an email from, say, Proton Mail to a Gmail account, the message has to be decrypted at the Proton servers. Proton will see the messages, and so will all the mail relays between you and Gmail, including Google themselves. And it's not just Gmail. Every email provider has the same level of access. So email was never really designed to be secure. And there's other things that you can do, PGP encryption. So even with that, you could actually send an encrypted message from a Gmail account to someone else, and the actual content of the message is encrypted. Google cannot read it, but you still have to share the keys with the other person. That gets a bit deeper and a bit more complicated. But I don't think we need to rely on email. And this is why it bothers me when certain organizations will ask me, oh, we need to prove it's you, send us your government ID over email. I've had healthcare providers try and do this, and even financial institutions. It's quite shocking. Now, these days, almost everyone, certainly businesses, have moved to cloud providers like Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace. Now, these providers certainly have much better security than we had in 2004. Better spam filtering, better authentication, better encryption. But they still have the same fundamental access to your messages. Now, email headers, they haven't changed much either. These are basically the metadata of your message. So it's information about where the email has come from, what servers it has passed through, even what software that was used to send it. And back in 2004, I'd often look at these headers to try and track an email's entire journey across the internet. And today, those same headers exist. So I'm in Proton Mail now. I'm going to open an email, click on the three dots, and I'm going to click on View Headers. Now, you can copy that whole thing or download it as a text file because it's quite a lot. Now, if that email you open, in my case, it's from a Proton Mail user, all I see, it says begin PGP message, and then it's all encrypted. I cannot read that. But the headers still will say to me who the message is to, who it's from, the date, the content type, it's text, HTML, and a few other things, the spam score, the original path, the return path. But because it's Proton to Proton, there's very little in the metadata that would be of any concern. So if you email me at lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com and you're using a Proton account, that message is end-to-end encrypted. Now, what has changed significantly is authentication. And in 2004, spoofing of email was actually quite easy to do. In fact, I did a demonstration of this for my boss at the time. I sent him an email from bill@microsoft.com. Today, I can't do that as easily. We have things like Sender Policy Framework, SPF, DKIM, DMARC. These are all protocols that help verify that the email actually came from where it claims to have come from. Now, these are just add-ons, though, to the basic email system. They're not even part of the core protocol. But they do go some way to protecting the authenticity of the email itself. I think the big change is end-to-end encryption. I've already mentioned Proton Mail, there's Tutanota as well, and these really do help solve the privacy problem, at least by encrypting messages between users of the same platform. But that is the catch. This only works if both the sender and the recipient are using the same secure email service. And which is why for anything sensitive, I use Signal or Session. They're the two secure messaging platforms that I personally use and would recommend. But let's talk about something that made waves in the past few weeks when Mark Zuckerberg appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast. Now, for those of us in the privacy community, what he said is not exactly surprising, but it's pretty significant that the CEO of Meta is openly acknowledging these vulnerabilities. So this is what happened. Mark confirmed that what many of us have been saying for years, and that's end-to-end encryption isn't just some magical shield that makes your messages completely private. And in this case, with WhatsApp, it prevents Meta from seeing the content of the WhatsApp messages on the servers. But that does not mean anything if someone can access your device directly. And the same would apply to Signal. Now, this came up because of Tucker Carlson's claims about intelligence agencies accessing his Signal communications. And look, whether you agree with Tucker or not isn't the point here. But what's important is understanding how this access works. When you send a message in Signal or WhatsApp, it is encrypted as it travels from your phone to your friend's phone. There's end-to-end encryption, great. But once it lands on the other device, that message is sitting there in the app's local storage. If someone has access to that phone, whether that's law enforcement with a warrant or someone using spyware, Pegasus, it doesn't even have to be that advanced. Someone could just have your phone's passcode. They can still see everything. Now, Mark Zuckerberg mentioned disappearing messages as a potential solution for this. And I think, while that's better than nothing, let's just be realistic about what that actually does. Disappearing messages can help, but they're not foolproof. Someone could still take a screenshot of your messages. And if the device is compromised, they're going to be captured anyway before they disappear. Now, I'm not saying encryption isn't important. It absolutely is. But again, it's a layer of security, not the whole solution. So I think what we really need to be thinking about is device security as a whole. This is why I always recommend that we think about segmentation. Maybe your primary phone isn't where you keep your most sensitive communications. Maybe you need a separate device for certain conversations. And this is why I use Graphene OS. You can have a separate user profile and just have Signal or Session in that profile. So even if someone grabbed your phone while you're using it in the street, you're not logged in to the sensitive profile with your banking or perhaps your Proton account, whatever it may be. Now, the other thing that bothers me about Mark's comments is this implication that we should just accept this level of potential surveillance as normal. Sure, law enforcement sometimes needs access to communications for legitimate investigations. But the existence of tools that completely compromise a device, especially with zero user interaction, is a completely different level of invasion that we really need to be talking about. So for anyone who is concerned about this, I recommend two things. First, think about message retention the same way you think about data retention. Just because an app can keep all your messages forever doesn't mean it should. So use disappearing message features, just don't rely on it. Now, I'm going to say this again, and it is important. Consider moving to a hardened mobile OS like Graphene. When Mark Zuckerberg talks about agencies accessing devices, he's talking about exploiting vulnerabilities in the standard Android and iOS operating system. Graphene OS significantly reduces the attack surface. Now, I carry a Pixel 8 Pro running Graphene OS as my daily driver, and I recommend it to anyone who is privacy conscious. When you combine Graphene OS with good operational security, that's OPSEC, like I said, putting Signal or Proton accounts in a separate user profile, you're now creating that segmentation, those layers of protection. Now, the spyware tools that Mark mentioned, well, they rely on exploiting vulnerabilities that Graphene OS specifically protects against. It may still have a 0 day, but I would say your risk profile is now very low. Now, I know switching to Graphene OS isn't for everyone. It does require some willingness to leave this conventional iOS or Android ecosystem, but if you're seriously concerned about device level security and the kind of surveillance capabilities that Mark Zuckerberg was describing, it's absolutely worth considering. But at the end of the day, any data that exists can potentially be accessed. The only truly private message is one that no longer exists. So I think while that might sound extreme, it's the reality of our digital world and something we all need to be thinking about when we decide what to share and who to share it with. All right, I think I'll end the show there. But before I go, I have a favour to ask. If you are enjoying the podcast, please share it with your friends. Now, Reddit has a privacy subreddit. I don't even have a Reddit account anymore. So if you do have one and you see someone asking questions about how to get started in privacy, perhaps you would be kind enough to mention this podcast. I would just like to reach more people with some practical privacy and security tips. Now, for a future episode, I'm not sure if it will be the next one or the one after that, but I am planning a special guest. And this is one I think you will all like very much. But I'm going to keep you in suspense for now, and I'll talk to you soon.